Hello, my friends, and welcome back to my channel. Tonight, I want to share a story about a woman who tried to outrun her past and a man who had spent years trying to forget his own. It's a story about lost forgiveness and the quiet power of the desert to heal what the world has broken. So take a breath, settle in, and let's begin. The desert remembers every promise ever broken. It holds them like old bones buried beneath red dust. And time out here. Nothing truly disappears. It just waits for the wind to uncover it again. The year was 1889. Winter had come early to the New Mexico territory, and the red mesa lay vast and silent beneath a sky the color of smoke. The wind moved like a whispering spirit across the canyons, stirring dry grass and scattering the tracks of every living thing gliding through that endless quiet. Was a woman named Josie Wells. She was 32, though the desert wind had already traced sorrow in the corners of her eyes. Once she had been a school teacher in Boston, graceful, soft-spoken, and full of plans. But life, as it often does, had other lessons waiting. A husband who loved the sound of his own ambition more than her laughter. A child taken by fever before he could speak her name, and one day without ceremony or goodbyes. Josie packed what little was left of her life and rode west. Toward a horizon she didn't understand, only knowing she couldn't stay where her heart had died. Days turned into weeks. The towns thinned, then vanished until all that remained was sand, wind, and sky. The desert didn't comfort her. It didn't care who she had been or what she'd lost. It simply stripped her down to what was true. By the time the storm came, she was already half gone. The sun had fallen low, bleeding red, behind the cliffs. Her horse stumbled on loose rock. Throwing her hard into the dust, she rose unsteadily, dazed, a bruise blooming across her temple. The world-spun wind howled through the gullies, dragging the scent of rain and grit. Her horse spooked and wild disappeared into the coming dusk. She called after it once, twice, then stopped. Even her voice seemed to vanish into the air, so she walked. Each step sank into the sand. Her skirts whipped around her legs. Her lips cracked with thirst. When the dust storm finally broke over the mesa, it came like judgment. The sky turned black. The earth vanished, and she was swallowed whole, blind, coughing. She stumbled forward until the world became nothing but noise, wind, grit, the beating of her own frightened heart. And then there was silence. She fell near a dry arroyo, her hands sinking into the cold sand. Her last thought before the dark took her was of her son's small hand curled inside hers. A memory, soft as the sound of his breathing, then nothing far from the town. Beyond the ridges where only hawks kept watch. A man was moving through the storm. His name was Zeke Callahan, and now by choice a ghost of both worlds. The army had called him Scout. His people had called him Lost. So he had chosen neither. He lived alone among the canyons, where the wind spoke a language older than sorrow that night. He felt the storm before he saw it, this pressure in the air, the way the hawk on his shoulder went still. He turned his horse toward the shelter of the cliffs. But then something caught his eye, a figure in the sand. At first he thought it was driftwood, a trick of the dust. Then he saw a hand, pale, still, human. He was off the horse in a heartbeat, kneeling beside her. Her face was white with grit, her pulse barely there, her dress torn and heavy with dust. He pressed his ear to her chest, heard the faint echo of a heartbeat. Still here, he murmured, voice rough from disuse. He lifted her carefully, her weight light as memory. The storm clawed at them both, but he pushed through it step by step, against the wind, until the darkness swallowed man and woman alike. Hours later, inside a small shelter carved into the stone of the mesa, a fire cracked to life. Zeke laid her down beside it, wrapped her in a buffalo hide, and sat in silence. The flames painted his weathered face in gold and shadow. He didn't know her name or her story. He only knew the look of someone trying to escape ghosts too heavy to carry. Outside, the desert howled. Inside, the fire whispered. And in the quiet, two lost souls began to find the faint rhythm of a heartbeat neither of them thought they still had. She had run from her past. He had buried his. And yet, in the silence of the desert, both began to stir again. When consciousness returned, it came slowly like dawn creeping over the mountains. At first, Josie Wells felt only warmth, a steady living warmth pressed close against her skin, chasing away the ache of cold that had buried itself deep inside her bones. Then she heard the sound of wood popping and the low hum of wind beyond stone walls. Her eyes fluttered open. The light was dim golden flickering. She was lying beneath heavy hides that smelled of smoke and earth. Her head throbbed faintly, and when she tried to move, the world tilted sideways. Across the small room, a man sat by the fire motionless, but for the steady rhythm of his hands. He was feeding the flames one branch at a time, as though tending something sacred. His hair was dark, bound loosely at the neck. His shoulders were broad, his posture quiet and sure. When he finally spoke, his voice came low, rough as gravel smoothed by time. "You're safe," he said. "The desert takes what it wants, but not today." For a moment, she didn't trust her voice enough to answer. Her throat felt dry. Her lips cracked. She swallowed hard. Where am I shelter?" he said simply. "My Misa." His tone was neither gentle nor harsh, just a matter of fact, as if words were tools to be used sparingly. She looked around. The walls were built of red stone. The ceiling was low. Bundles of herbs hung near the fire, their scent clean and sharp. There was a sense of order in the space, every object placed with purpose, every corner touched by care. Her heart began to slow its racing, but unease lingered like a shadow. She remembered the storm, the horse, the fall, and now this man, this silence. She pushed herself up slightly, the hide slipping from her shoulders. "My horse," she managed. "Did you?" He shook his head once. "Gone. The storm took it east. You were lucky it didn't take you with it." Lucky. The word felt strange in her mouth. She wanted to ask who he was, why he'd helped her, but the questions tangled somewhere between her ribs. For a long while, neither spoke. The firelight painted the walls in restless gold. Outside, the wind howled against the rock, but inside, only breath and crackling flame filled the space. Then a sound, a sharp cry, cut through the quiet. Her gaze darted toward the doorway where a hawk perched on a wooden beam, feathers ruffled, eyes glinting like pieces of amber. The man turned toward it with a faint nod. "Eat," Zeke Callahan murmured. "The storm's not done yet." The hawk tilted its head, then began tearing into a scrap of meat left on the ledge. Josie blinked. "Zeke," she repeated softly. "That's your bird's name." The man looked at her for the first time, really looked. His eyes were dark, steady, unreadable. "No," he said after a pause. "It's mine." She felt her pulse quicken. The name hung in the air between them, simple and solid. Zeke, a name that felt carved, not spoken. He turned back to the fire, lifted a small pot, and poured something into a wooden bowl. The smell reached her first rabbit herbs and a trace of sage. He crossed the room, set the bowl within her reach. "Eat," he said. "You need strength." She hesitated. Then Josie Wells accepted it with shaking hands. The stew was thin but warm. The first bite made her throat ache with gratitude. She didn't know how to express it. Zeke Callahan sat again silent, watching the fire, not her, in the stillness. She noticed small details. The scar running across his knuckles, the thin leather cord around his neck, and the pendant that hung from it. A hawk carved from bone, its wings spread wide. The edges were worn smooth. polished by years of touch. Her gaze lingered on it. "You carved that?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Long time ago. It's beautiful." "Just a bird," he said. "But it remembers the sky." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She wanted to ask what he meant, but his eyes had already returned to the flames, and she sensed questions weren't welcome here. Not yet. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was alive, humming with something she couldn't name. Gratitude, fear, curiosity, all tangled together. She ate slowly, aware of him across the fire, of the rhythm of his breath and the low whistle of wind through the stone cracks, every now and then. The hawk stirred at the door, feathers rustling like the turning of pages in some old forgotten book when she finished. She whispered a soft thank you. He didn't answer, only nodded once and fed another branch into the fire. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Inside, warmth and unease kept her awake. She pulled the hide tighter around her shoulders, stealing a glance toward the man who had pulled her back from death. He looked carved from the very mesa that surrounded them still. Strong, unknowable. She didn't yet know whether she'd been rescued or captured, but for now she knew this much. The storm had not killed her, and for reasons she could not explain, that truth frightened her more than the storm itself. The days passed, and the storm softened. Wind still sang across the mesa, but the notes had changed less like warning, more like memory. The air smelled of ash and wet earth, and each morning the desert light crept a little closer to the cave's entrance, warming the stone. Josie was stronger now. Her hands no longer trembled when she reached for water, and color had returned to her face. But though her body mended, her mind stayed cautious like a bird who's learned too well the cost of trusting open skies. Zeke Callahan worked outside most of the day, his rhythm unbroken, chopping wood, setting snares, checking the water jars, every motion deliberate, never hurried. There was a stillness in him that reminded her of prayer, not the kind spoken in churches, but the kind made in silence, when the heart doesn't know what words could possibly be enough. She watched him sometimes from the doorway, the way he knelt to patch a water skin, the way he paused before each swing of the axe, as if listening for something deep in the earth before he moved. It wasn't strength that defined him. It was steadiness, the kind she hadn't seen in a long time, maybe ever. He didn't ask about her past, and she didn't offer it. There was safety in that silence, a fragile truce between two people who understood that questions could be sharper than knives at night. When the wind grew restless again, she dreamed. In one dream, she was standing in a narrow street, rain falling hard, her hands outstretched. A child's voice called her name, Mama, over and over, from somewhere she couldn't reach. When she tried to move, her feet sank into the mud, and the world dissolved into water and grief. She woke with a gasp, the taste of rain still on her tongue. The fire was low. The air thickened with the smell of wood smoke. Across from her, Zeke Callahan sat cross-legged, mending a leather strap with quiet precision. The light from the embers drew the edges of his face, strong jaw, lines of fatigue, eyes steady but kind. "You talk in your sleep," Zeke Callahan said after a while, not looking up. Josie Wells pressed a hand to her chest. "Do I?" He nodded. "Someone you miss." She hesitated, her throat tightening around the truth. "Someone I failed." The words came out softer than a whisper, but heavy enough to fill the room. Zeke's hands paused. He didn't speak, didn't turn, didn't offer false comfort. He simply nodded once as if to say he understood. That quiet acceptance settled deeper into her than any kindness could have. For a long time they sat like that, the fire crackling between them, shadows breathing across the walls. There was sorrow in the silence. Yes, but there was gentleness too. A space big enough for both of them to exist without needing to hide what hurt. By morning, something in her had shifted. The ache was still there, but it no longer ruled her. So, she began to move again slowly, purposefully. She swept the floor with a bundle of dried sage. She boiled water, patched a tear in one of the hides, and gathered small stones to line the fire pit. Little things, but after so many months of drifting and running, those small gestures felt like building a life. When Zeke Callahan returned from the ridge that afternoon, he found the shelter tidied, a pot of broth warming by the fire. Josie Wells was sitting by the entrance, hair brushed and tied, her hands resting in her lap. She looked up and smiled, not out of obligation, but out of quiet pride. He didn't say a word, but his eyes softened. He hung his gear, added a few sticks to the fire, and nodded toward the pot. "Smells better than rabbit," he murmured. Her smile widened. It might even be edible. That evening they shared the meal in comfortable silence. The firelight flickered over their faces, gold against shadow, warmth against memory. Josie Wells found herself studying him again. The shape of his hands, the calm in his movements. She wondered what ghosts he carried, what stories he buried in the sand. But something told her not to ask. Not yet. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you." He looked at her, puzzled. "For what?" "For not asking," she replied. He nodded slowly. "The desert teaches that. Sometimes the wind carries words that shouldn't be spoken." She let that truth sink in. Outside, the storm clouds drifted away, leaving a clear stretch of stars. Inside, the shadows danced across the walls, not menacing but alive. For the first time since she'd come west, Josie Wells didn't feel like a woman lost in someone else's story. Here, among stone and silence, she was beginning to write her own again. The fire burned lower, and she watched the embers pulse and fade, the glow tracing every scar, every secret. Both of them tried to keep. And as sleep took her, she thought of how memory worked, how some parts of the past burn out clean, and others linger, like the glow of a fire that refuses to die. In the soft light of the flames, she turned once toward him and whispered, though she didn't mean to speak aloud. Maybe that's what surviving really is, learning to live beside the things that still burn. Zeke Callahan didn't answer, but she saw his gaze flick toward her, steady and unafraid. In that quiet, the desert silence wrapped around them, both no longer empty, but full. A silence that, somehow, felt like the beginning of peace. By the fourth morning, the storm had gone, leaving the mesa washed clean beneath a sky so wide it could swallow every secret. Josie Wells stepped outside for the first time without trembling. The air smelled of wet dust and juniper smoke, and the world seemed to hum not loudly, but in a rhythm she could almost feel beneath her skin. She stood still for a long while, just breathing it in. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was alive. Every sound had its place. The wind threading through the jacks, gliding somewhere beyond sight. The land didn't speak in words. It spoke in patience. Zeke Callahan watched her from a few paces away, arms folded, expression unreadable. Then he said almost to himself, "The land speaks. Most folks just don't wait long enough to hear it." Josie Wells turned toward him. "And you?" "I've been listening all my life," he said. "Still don't understand half of what it's trying to tell me." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the point." That day became a beginning, not of something grand or sudden, but of something steady. He started to teach her small things. How to tell where water hides beneath dry ground, the way the grass bends differently, the coolness of the air just above it. How to follow the stars if the trail disappears. How to move quietly enough that the land itself forgets you're there. She listened, not just to his words, but to the pauses between them, the way he treated silence as part of the lesson, not an absence. And in those pauses, she began to understand the rhythm of his life. Everything had its season. Everything waited for its turn. Sometimes when she caught him studying the horizon, she wondered if he was waiting still for forgiveness. Maybe. Or for something long past to stop echoing inside him. That evening, the sky turned copper, and they sat by the fire with a pot of beans simmering between them. Josie Wells stirred it too long, distracted by a question she wasn't sure she should ask. When she lifted the spoon, smoke billowed up and the smell was unmistakable. She grimaced. "I think I've just committed a crime against beans for the first time since I've met you." Zeke Callahan laughed not loudly, but deep and sudden, like a sound that had been trapped for years. It startled her so much that she began laughing too. The two of them doubled over, the sound rolling across the little stone room. When it quieted, the fire popped once, and for a heartbeat the world felt right, simple, human, no ghosts, no shame, just the echo of laughter and the warmth of shared breath. Later that night, when the stars had spilled across the sky, she found him sitting near the entrance, sharpening a blade, his head, soft her, edged with something she couldn't name. "Zeke Callahan," she said quietly. "How long have you lived up here?" He didn't look at her right away, long enough to forget what year it is. "Why stay so far from everyone?" He drew the blade across the stone, slow and careful before setting it down. "Because silence is the only thing that never lied to me." His words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling outward, settling deep. Josie Wells didn't reply. She knew, instinctively, that this was not something to fill with sympathy. It was truth, heavy and sacred. After a while, he continued, his voice rough but steady. "I was a scout once. Rode with soldiers who didn't see us as men, just tools to find other men. I told myself it was survival. But every mile I rode, I felt myself vanish a little more. One day, I couldn't stand the sound of my own name in their mouths." He looked up then, eyes dark and bright at once, "So I left. Came here. Figured the wind wouldn't ask me to betray anyone." Josie Wells' heart tightened. "You were trying to start over." He gave a faint smile, a humorless smile, or disappear quietly. Depends on how you look at it. Josie Wells studied his face in the firelight, the quiet strength, the scars that told their own kind of story. And in that moment, she understood something: loneliness. When chosen, it becomes its own kind of armor. Neither spoke again for a long time. The only sound was the low hiss of the fire and the night wind brushing through the cracks of stone. When she finally lay down, the echo of his words stayed with her. "Silence is the only thing that never lied to me." But for the first time in years, she found herself wondering, could silence also be the thing that heals outside? The desert slept beneath its wide, endless sky. Inside, the fire dimmed to embers. And in the hush that followed, their hearts, one burdened by guilt, the other by grief, began to beat to the same quiet rhythm. Not romance, not love, but trust. Days on the mesa had begun to flow like the wind, silent, steady, almost circular. Josie Wells no longer counted them. Morning bled into afternoon, and each dusk arrived wrapped in the same amber quiet, as if time itself had decided to rest for a while. The shelter had grown familiar now, not just a refuge, but a rhythm. She knew the way the light moved across the floor at dawn, the sound of Zeke and Callahan's steps outside, the exact moment when the fire's crackle turned from warmth to whisper. It was peace, of a kind she hadn't known in years. And yet beneath that peace, something waited, something with her name on it. It fell into her gloves, a worn shawl, the satchel she'd arrived with. The leather had grown stiff from the storm, but when she unbuckled its strap, a small shape slid free and fell into her lap. A locket, dented, tarnished. The sight of it hit her like a fist to the chest. She hadn't seen it since the train ride west. She'd thought it lost. maybe stolen. Her hands trembled as she brushed the dust away and pried it open. Inside, beneath a cracked pane of glass, was a miniature portrait. A boy, her boy, barely 3 years old, captured in careful watercolor. Blonde curls, gray eyes, the faintest trace of a smile, a memory small enough to fit in her palm and heavy enough to break her heart all over again. The air left her lungs in a sharp, helpless sound. Suddenly she was back in that narrow Boston bedroom, the one with the window that looked out on the elm trees. She could smell the sickness again, the sour sweat of fever, the endless whisper of prayers that went unanswered. She saw her husband's face, pale and distant, not cruel, just hollow. The way he'd closed the door softly when the doctor came for the last time. How in the weeks that followed, his touch vanished first, and then his words. How she'd watched the life drain not just from her child, but from the man who'd promised to love her forever. And then the journey west, not to find something new, but to outrun the sound of her own heartbeat, echoing through empty rooms. It all came back in a single breath. Every loss, every failure, every if only. The fire blurred before her eyes. Zeke Callahan found her sitting on the floor, the locket opened in her hands, tears streaming silently down her face. He didn't speak. He didn't touch her. He simply sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, but not so close that it felt like pity. The only sound was her quiet sobbing and the crack of pine in the fire. When the storm inside her finally broke into silence, he spoke, his voice soft, low, and steady. Grief, he said, is just love with nowhere left to go. The words hung in the air like smoke, fragile and eternal, all at once. She closed the locket gently and held it against her chest, as though afraid the memory might slip away again. Does it ever stop hurting? Josie Wells asked. Not if it's real. But hurt can change its shape. After a while, it sits beside you, instead of inside you. She looked at him, really looked. For the first time she saw not a stranger, but another survivor, someone who understood the quiet cruelty of remembering. The firelight painted his face in shifting gold and shadow. His eyes reflected the same loneliness she'd seen in her own reflection. Too many nights to count. And for the first time, she didn't want to hide hers. Zeke Callahan stayed there with her until the tears dried, until the locket stopped trembling in her hand. No words, no comfort, just company. Sometimes that's all the heart needs to keep beating. That night she dreamed again, but this time there was no child, no laughter echoing through the rain. There was only the storm, the one she'd ridden into when she'd left her old life behind. In the dream, she saw herself in the saddle, wind tearing at her cloak, the sky collapsing into red dust. She wasn't running from grief anymore. She was riding through it. And for the first time she could see the outline of a man on the horizon waiting, not chasing. She couldn't tell if it was Zeke Callahan or something older, larger than him, but it didn't matter. He stood still, like the mountain itself, while she rode closer. When she woke, dawn was breaking, the air cold and clear. Zeke Callahan was already outside feeding the fire for coffee, his movements quiet and deliberate. The smell of smoke drifted in through the open doorway, mixed with the scent of morning sage. She rose slowly, locket in hand, and stepped toward the light. Zeke, she said softly. He turned, brow lifting in silent question. I thought I came west to disappear, she said. Maybe I came to remember. For a long moment he just looked at her. Then he nodded. Once. That's what the desert does, he said. It strips away what you don't need, until all that's left is the truth. She smiled faintly. And what if the truth hurts? Then you're finally alive again, he answered. Their eyes met steady, unguarded. Something wordless passed between them, something that wasn't quite dangerous as the first fire after winter. The wind moved softly through the canyon, carrying away the ashes of the night. And somewhere deep inside her, Josie Wells felt the weight of memory settle, not like a chain, but like a name she could finally say without breaking. For the first time, she didn't fear the past, because someone else had seen it now, and stayed. By late winter, the mesa had found its rhythm again. The nights were cold, but the days were long and golden, filled with the simple music of living, the scrape of wood against stone, the soft rattle of wind through the cedar branches, the quiet talk of two souls who no longer needed many words. Josie Wells had begun to hum again soft, aimless tunes that drifted through the small shelter like echoes of a world long gone. Zeke Callahan pretended not to listen, though she caught him smiling once when she burned the biscuits for a second time. Peace, fragile and precious, had settled between them. But peace in the West was always a borrowed thing. It happened one afternoon while Zeke Callahan was gone hunting along the ridge. Josie Wells was mending a tear in the hides near the doorway when she heard the sound, distant at first. Then closer, the steady rhythm of hooves cutting through sand. Her hands froze. No one came this way. The riders appeared from behind the rocks, 3 of them, dust-stained, faces hard with sun and distance. Their coats still carried the remnants of old army insignias. Men who didn't know how to stop being soldiers, even when the war had long since ended. The first one dismounted. His boots crunched against the gravel. He had the look of someone used to giving orders, gray eyes, jaw like carved stone, a rifle slung casually across his back. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, removing his hat but not his suspicion. "Didn't expect to find company up here. We're looking for Apache raiders. Heard word one's been spotted in these parts." Josie Wells' pulse quickened. Her voice came steady, though it trembled beneath the surface. "There's no one here but me." The man's eyes swept the shelter, taking in the hides, the tools, the marks of another presence. "Funny," he said. "This place don't look like a lady's doing, more like a trapper's den." She met his gaze, willing herself not to flinch. "I said I'm alone." He studied her face a moment longer, then smirked. "You got a name, miss?" The question sliced sharper than it sounded. Her name, the one she had nearly forgotten, hung heavy on her tongue before she could answer. One of the younger riders spoke up, holding a weathered sheet of paper. "Lieutenant, you might want to see this." He handed it over. The leader unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the ink lines. A drawing, a name printed bold beneath it. "Josie Wells." He read aloud, the syllables tasting like ash. "Says here you ran off from your husband, took some inheritance money that wasn't yours." Her stomach dropped. "That's a lie. Paper says otherwise," the man replied, voice almost bored. "He's offering good coin for anyone who brings news of you. Guess that makes you worth something again." The words hit harder than the desert wind. Her past, the one she'd tried to bury under miles of sand, had found her. "I stole nothing," she said, her voice shaking. "My husband, he—" But the words wouldn't come. There was no way to explain the truth to men who had already decided what they wanted to believe. The leader folded the paper, slipped it into his coat. "Doesn't matter much. Either way, your Apache friend will have some explaining to do when he gets back." Josie Wells's breath caught. "What do you mean?" He gave a cold smile. "Word in town is the army still keeps tabs on half-breeds. Scout goes missing. They tend to ask why. You're keeping company with one makes both of you suspicious." The sound of another voice, deeper, familiar, came from behind them. "Then you can tell the army there's nothing here worth their trouble." The riders turned. Zeke Callahan stood at the edge of the clearing, bow in hand, eyes sharp as wind fell still. The leader's smirk faltered. "You must be the one we heard about." Zeke Callahan's tone stayed calm, but there was steel beneath it. "You've heard wrong. The first man took a step forward. "You got no right to harbor a fugitive, and you got no right to ride this far uninvited." The words cracked like thunder. What happened next was fast, the kind of fast that leaves only sound and smoke behind. A scuffle, a shout, the flash of steel. By the time the echo died, the riders were retreating down the trail, one clutching his shoulder, the others swearing vengeance. Zeke Callahan stood still, chest heaving, the bowstring trembling in his hand. Josie Wells's voice broke the silence. "You should have let them take me." He turned toward her, eyes dark with disbelief. "I don't let the land I live on decide who I protect." "That's not your choice," she cried. "You don't understand what they'll do now to you, to this place. You've seen what men like that are capable of." He took a slow step forward. "So have you. That's why I didn't let them touch you." Her throat tightened. "You think that's mercy? You've just tied your fate to mine. You don't even know who I am." "I know enough," Zeke Callahan said quietly. "You were lost. You still are, but that don't make you guilty." For a moment neither spoke. The fire cracked between them like a living thing, the air thick with everything unspoken. Then Josie Wells did the one thing she hadn't done since he'd found her. She turned away. Fear had taken root, deep and cold, not fear of him, but of what she might cost him. She packed what little she owned: the shawl, the locket, the small knife he'd given her to cut herbs, and stepped into the doorway. The wind outside had begun to rise again, whispering low, the way it had the night they first met. Zeke Callahan's voice followed her, low but breaking. "Josie, don't go, not into that storm." She looked back once, her hair catching the firelight. "You should have let me disappear the first time," she said softly. Then she was gone, swallowed by red dust and distance. The sky darkened. The wind howled. And the first time he crossed the mesa, the same cruel season returning to finish what it had started. And as Zeke Callahan stood in the doorway, the fire dying behind him, he knew what the desert was trying to tell him all along. Peace, like love, is never something you keep. It's something you chase into the storm. Night fell over the mesa like a cloud. The storm came fast, wild, and merciless. Not rain this time, but snow. Hard and blinding, it hissed through the canyon like some restless spirit returned for what it was owed. Zeke Callahan was already in the saddle before the fire behind him died. He didn't stop to gather supplies. He didn't stop to think. There was only the wind, and the faint trail of her tracks weaving through the drifts, like a ghost's signature. He followed them down the slope, his breath raw, his lashes crusted with ice. The cold cut through every layer of him, but the ache in his chest burned hotter than the winter could ever touch. He rode hard, leaning into the storm, his horse trembling beneath him, the air so thick he could barely see his own hand. Every few minutes, the tracks vanished beneath new snow, then reappeared again, faint, uncertain. Like her resolve, he pushed on, whispering her name into the gale, not as a rescuer, but as a man finally speaking what he had buried for too long. "Josie," he shouted, his voice torn by the wind. "Josie, you listen to me now. You weren't my burden. You were my blessing." The sound vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the storm. But he said it again anyway, because sometimes the desert listens, and sometimes it carries what it hears. He crested a ridge and spotted something dark against the snow, a shape half buried near a clump of juniper. Her horse, riderless. Panic struck like lightning. For a long moment, he could only stare at the animal's wide, frightened eyes, the reins dragging, the saddle empty. Then he moved again, faster now, half sliding down the slope, calling her name until his voice broke. The desert gave no answer but the sound of the wind and the thud of his boots in the drifts. He found her near the canyon rim, crumpled beneath the willows, her shawl stiff with frost, her face pale as moonlight. Her hands were raw, bloodied, the locket still clutched in her fist, as if she'd tried to hold on to the last thing that mattered. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. He dropped to his knees beside her, his breath coming in short, strained bursts. He touched her face cold, too cold. He pressed his fingers to her throat, searching. Then there, a pulse, faint, fragile, still fighting. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely to whatever power might be listening. "Thank you." He gathered her into his arms, wrapping his coat around them both. The snow stung his skin like fire, but he didn't feel it. Zeke Callahan found shelter beneath a low fire, his hands shaking as he coaxed life from the smallest spark. The flame caught, a flicker against the storm, fragile, stubborn, alive. He held her close, rubbing warmth into her hands, murmuring words he didn't even know he remembered how to say. "You think the world already took everything," he whispered. "It hasn't. Not yet. Not me." The flames danced weakly, and the snow hissed as it fell, melting on the stones. He could see his breath in the air, rising and vanishing, like prayers without names. He laid her head against his chest, feeling the faint rhythm of her heart, struggling beneath the layers of cloth and cold. "Stay with me," he said softly. "Stay." Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost its shape. The wind raged, but inside that small circle of light there was only the sound of two hearts refusing to quit. He thought of the first night he'd found her, half dead in the snow, how the fire had flickered between them, how silence had been their first language. He realized now he hadn't saved her then, not really. She had saved him. She had given his silence meaning again, and now she was slipping away into that same quiet. He closed his eyes, his voice breaking. "I should have told you sooner. I should have said it when there was time." His hand trembled as he brushed the frost from her hair. "You walked into my world like sunlight through smoke. You made the stillness bearable. You made it home." For a moment he thought he saw her lips move a flicker, barely there. Then her eyes opened, gray, clear, and filled with confusion that softened into something he recognized. "Trust. Josie Wells," he whispered. She blinked, the corners of her mouth trembling. "You still believe," she whispered, her breath, "in second chances." A broken laugh escaped him, half sob, half prayer. "Only because you walked into my silence," he said. Her eyelids fluttered. "Then maybe it was never silence," she murmured. "Maybe it was waiting." He held her tighter, feeling the faint heat returning to her skin, the slow, stubborn rhythm of life, pulsing against him. The fire crackled louder, as if drawing strength from their heartbeat. They stayed like that through the night. Two souls suspended between life and loss, surrounded by wind and snow, and the weight of everything they had both been running from. When the storm finally began to break, dawn crept over the desert in pale streaks of silver. The light found them still sitting together. The fire burned low, their faces drawn but alive. Zeke Callahan stirred first, his body stiff and aching. He looked down at her, still asleep, her breathing steady now, color returning to her cheeks. For the first time in years he smiled, not the sharp, guarded smile of a man who expects everything to be taken from him, but the quiet, reverent kind that comes only when something lost has been found again. He whispered to the waking sky, "Thank you for the storm." Josie Wells stirred, eyes blinking open, dazed by the brightness. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Are we still alive?" He chuckled softly. "For now." She frowned, still half dreaming. I thought I heard you talking in my sleep." "You did," he said. "I said too much." She looked at him, the corners of her mouth curving faintly. "Then say it again." He hesitated. Then quietly, "You weren't my burden. You were my blessing." Her gaze softened, tears glinting in her lashes. "Then maybe I was meant to lose everything first." Zeke Callahan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Josie Wells's face. "You didn't lose everything. Not yet." And they sat together in the fragile morning light, the desert around them, silent and still. Not the silence of emptiness this time, but of peace, hard-won. In that moment, they were no longer two people bound by guilt and loss. They were two survivors who had finally met at the edge of what life had left them and found it was enough. The storm had taken almost everything, but it had also given something back, a truth as old as the desert itself that love once buried beneath silence and sorrow can still rise again, fragile as dawn, and just as unstoppable. And as the first sunlight spilled over the red mesa, Zeke Callahan whispered the words the wind had carried all along. "You think the world already took everything. It hasn't. Not yet. Not me." This time Josie Wells heard him. This time she believed it. Spring came slowly to the red mesa, as if the earth itself had to be convinced it was safe to breathe again. The snow melted first in the shallow ravines, then along the ridges, carrying instead the scent of sage and wild honey. Josie Wells woke one morning to the sound of water running. She stepped outside and found the world shimmering, the mesa alive again. Green creeping through red stone, the air bright and clean. The silence she'd once feared now sounded different. It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was space, room for things to grow. Zeke Callahan had already been up for hours repairing the corral. The storm had taken much, but not his determination. He straightened, wiped the sweat from his brow, and gave her that small, quiet nod she'd come to know as his version of good morning. The days found their rhythm again: work, laughter, and the comfort of knowing the other was near. Together they rebuilt, not as survivors clinging to what was left, but as partners shaping something new, a home carved from red clay and hope. The shelter became larger stone walls, patched and strengthened, a roof of cedar and sun-dried mud. A porch was added where they could sit in the evenings, watching the light crawl down the cliffs. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of coffee and pine. Where there had once been only silence and snow, there was now the hum of life, steady, human, and tender. Josie Wells found her purpose again in small, gentle ways. Once a teacher, she became one again. Children from the nearby settlement began visiting on warm afternoons, boys and girls with dirt-streaked cheeks and curious eyes. She taught them to read beneath the shade of the cottonwoods, their voices stumbling through the alphabet, laughter ringing like birdsong across the valley. She'd look up sometimes and see Zeke Callahan watching from the distance, his face unreadable but soft around the edges. He pretended to be busy fixing the fence, but he lingered there, always listening. Zeke Callahan raised a small herd of horses. Wild things tamed not by force but by patience. He spoke to them the same way he spoke to the land, quietly, with respect. Josie Wells would watch him from the porch as he brushed their coats in the evening light, the sun turning his hair the color of copper. There was grace in his stillness, in the way he moved through the world as if it were something sacred. One evening near sunset they sat side by side, watching the sky bleed into shades of gold and crimson. The air was warm, the kind of warmth that feels earned. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, and the sound rolled through the canyon like a prayer that didn't need words. Josie Wells broke the silence first. "The storm," she said softly, her eyes following the last lights slipping over the horizon. Gave me back what life took away, someone who listens. Zeke Callahan turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then he said, "And you gave me something louder than silence peace." The words settled between them like falling dust, gentle and final. She smiled, leaning her head lightly against his shoulder. For a while they just watched the world change colors, the kind of stillness that only two people who have weathered storms can share. The seasons passed gently. Summer came full of life and light. They planted a small garden near the stream, tomatoes, beans. Corn, stubborn little things that fought their way through the red soil and somehow thrived. Each evening, they'd water them together. And Josie Wells would laugh when the mule tried to eat the sprouts. Sometimes neighbors from the valley rode up bringing seeds, cloth, or stories. People talked about the couple on the mesa, how an Apache hermit and a lost Eastern lady had built something that survived both winter and judgment. They came curious, but they left changed, a little quieter, a little closer to them. 2. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale. The wind still howled, fences broke, crops failed now and then. But there was always enough firewood for the night, enough laughter to outlast the cold, enough love to make the silence a companion instead of an enemy. And sometimes when the moon rose over the canyon and the wind moved through the cottonwoods, Josie Wells would sit on the porch with a book in her lap, the pages fluttering, unread. She glanced toward Zeke and Callahan, sometimes mending a bridle, sometimes carving a piece of cedar, and she'd think, "This is what peace looks like, not the absence of pain, but the presence of grace." As the years turned, the land around them kept its memory. Every spring, wildflowers returned to the slopes, painting the mesa in color: purple lupine, yellow aster, crimson paintbrush. The same wind that had once carried snow and grief now carried laughter. And the same silence that had once felt endless now held echoes of children learning to spell, of fire crackling, of two voices murmuring by the hearth long after dark. Out here, under the wide red sky, time moved differently. Days became stories, and stories became a kind of prayer. And if you stand on that mesa now, when the evening light turns everything gold and the wind moves just right, you can almost hear them. The faint ring of her laughter, the low murmur of his voice. The land remembers every storm, but also every kindness. And sometimes that's enough to call it home. If this story warmed your heart tonight, let me know where you're listening from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this tale with someone who still believes in second chances. Until next time, may your nights be calm, your heart steady as the desert stars, and may you always find peace in the quiet places where love still speaks softly, but forever. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.